oriented to the short term, focused on potential ability rather than actual skill, willing to abandon past experience, and of course a self that is quite unsolidaristic when you compare it to my dad's generation or many of your experience at work. And of course Richard Sennett probably, subtextually added, blimey, it's a write-off. People like this are, the people who won't join unions, who undermine solidarity at work. And yet that is really the experience of many, not only service workers, but many workers in general at work today. I argue, quite simply, the revolts of 2010, 11, 12 show what this workforce looks like when it becomes collectively disillusioned, when it realizes that the whole offer of self-betterment that underpinned all this individuality has been withdrawn. And so where I differ from those critics of the horizontalist movement is this. First, these movements are not trying, part4, Gladwell, to take power. They're trying, consciously or unconsciously, to form a counterpower within capitalism. It's a counterpower that rejects the conformist and stereotyped mass culture that the elite and the mainstream media constantly try and throw at you, but they're not yet prepared to offer an alternative to fight for power. And there is a strategic reason for this that will be all too close to the experience of some of the people in this room, that this generation has read about and learned the lessons of the 20th century. It has learned, as the communard Louise Michel once put it, power monopolized is evil. It has grown up with, as you maybe grew up with Marx, it has grown up with Foucault, with the psychoanalyst Deleuze and Guattari, with the idea that power relations inherent in hierarchical resistance movements are likely to give you, at best, George Galloway. At best. But at worst, the famine in the Soviet Union, which killed 20 million people, and the famine in China, which during the Great Leap Forward killed 36 million people, which are still not allowed to write about in China. And I had to interview a 72-year-old guy sitting in a tiny office with the actual papers on his floor, which are the only proof of the only book in China that explains why and how the famine of the early 60s took place. This generation have read Primo Levi on fascism, and they've read Vasily Grossman on Stalinism, and they are determined that whatever they do to resist capitalism, they're not going to recreate what the 20th century recreated. No, it limits what they're prepared to do. And those of you who know your labour history will recognize something else. Even though they will probably, it would drive them crazy to be told this, and does when I say it, by trying to carve out an alternative, more civilized, more self-controlled space within capitalism, to live, as one theorist puts it, despite capitalism, they're doing exactly what the pre-Leninist workers' movement did in the late 19th century. They do remind me of Edward Bernstein, the German social democrat, the most right-wing, the most centrist of German social democracy in the early 20th century, who famously said, the way is everything, the goal is nothing. Lenin, of course, hated that because he said, you're turning the labour movement into kind of social work to let us coexist with capitalism. The modern horizontalist movements do remind me of that, because that is, in fact, what they want. It's a very short distance from Bernsteinite social democracy to that, which is the famous poster of 2011, the Occupy poster. What is our one demand? Occupy Wall Street, bring a tent. But look, unless you're a complete dummy at semiology, I'll just explain it to you. What is our one demand is this, yeah? And whatever that means to you, you will react to it individually. You're not meant to react to it as one monolithic mass and kind of stand up and shout a slogan. You're meant to react to it individually. It's a photo montage. It's not real. There's no real rioters down here on Broad Street in New York City. This is where this Merrill Lynch bull is. And, the longer I go on about it, the more prosaic I make it sound. But to me, that's one of the most inspiring images of modern politics. Furthermore, I would argue, there is no such thing anymore as normal life. Thomas Frank wants these people to move away and turn back towards normal life. Normal life has become very fragmented and febrile because of the crisis. Those who think by immersing themselves in maybe a working men's club or becoming an organizer for a trade union, as some of them have done, the indignados somehow connect to a reality that will rectify all their weaknesses that are demonstrated by these quotes. I think I'm missing the point. But in New York, with Hurricane Sandy, where the occupiers went out and started doing relief work, where the state failed, and to a much larger extent in Spain, where the M15 movement, the indignados, have, a bit like the Russian Narodniks, gone to the people and actually started doing work with downtrodden working-class communities, squats, squatting land, helping people squat buildings when they've been evicted. They have fanned out into normal life, but what you find there are not shop stewards from Longbridge circa 1973. You find very dislocated and shattered people, very articulate, but more or less in the same position as you as a young person. Castells points out that the crisis has actually forced sections of the poor and the working class in Spain to adopt the very non-market alternative economic practices that the so-called lifestylists have been doing for years. Occupying, squatting, bartering, informal lending networks, informal creches. These things are forced on workers, whereas maybe sort of more of the children of the middle classes who dropped out chose to do them a decade earlier. You're seeing now a more or less mass adoption of what he calls non-capitalist forms of economic behavior. And he sums up what is for me a quite uncomfortable truth, and maybe for you, as follows. Networked social movements couldn't exist without the internet, but their significance is much deeper. They are suited for their role as agents of change in the network society. In sharp contrast, these are his words, not mine, but I agree with them. In sharp contrast with the obsolete political institutions inherited from a historically superseded social structure. And if he is right, then we're nowhere near the end of the fragmentation that will have to take place within parties, within liberalism, social democracy, conservatism even, churches, trade unions, Leninist parties, highly structured NGOs. They are all facing a new reality. And that is because of a third big factor that's driving change. Go back a bit. Where is it? This is a picture of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and I'll now explain why she's there. Okay. It is a change in human behavior, psychology, in thought patterns, attendant on the economic and technological changes. It's the least tangible, but I've come to the conclusion it's probably the most important of the changes, because it's the one that can survive all the reversals. When the horizontalist movements came up, and the culture around them of raves, of hip-hop, of activism, body art, sampling, sound sampling, photo montage, graphic novels, people immediately compared this movement to the 60s. In the book, I said there's a more profound parallel. That is with the era before World War I. It, too, was an era of even more rapid technological change than ours. Then, as now, many of the new technologies enhanced personal freedom. So in almost every novel of the Edwardian era, or the pre-war era in America, in France, in Britain, there's a liberated woman. Downton Abbey, it is always a liberated young woman who probably in real life and in the real historical period was far more liberated and more shocking than she appears in Downton Abbey. Okay? And there's often a very easily spottable closet gay man as well, because this was an era of sexual freedom. Virginia Woolf famously said, on or about December 1910, human character changed. And what she meant was the combined impact of modernism in art, suffragism, and the women's social and sexual rights movements, mass consumption, and new technology had begun to create new kinds of human beings. The Austrian novelist Stefan Zweig captured the same idea in his memoir, The World of Yesterday. Beards disappeared, he said, in Austria. Women showed their legs. They played sport. Quotes, there was more freedom and more beauty in the world in those 10 years. There was more freedom, informality, lack of inhibition than there had been in the entire preceding century. Now, I think we're living through a very similar period. And how has the internet and social media changed that? I think it completes and makes irreversible those smaller scale social revolutions that started in the late 60s. Women's rights, gay rights, divorce, contraception, the human rights revolution in general. In the West, psychologists and sociologists documented this change in behavior quite early on associated with internet use. A woman called Sherry Turkle, psychoanalyst, studying early computer gamers and bulletin board enthusiasts. I mean, some of the young people in this room don't realize that when I say computer gamers, we're talking about texts, people sending texts and arrows to each other, and a bulletin board is something you type into, okay? She, however, despite this meager technological base at the time, noted what she called the emergence of a decentered self that exists, no, gone too far, that exists in many worlds and plays many roles at the same time. And she argued that people were using the internet as, quotes, a social laboratory of the self. The science writer Margaret Wertheim argued more or less about the same time, remember this is before Twitter, before broadband, before Facebook, that we were using the internet to create what she called a collective mental arena, where the act of sharing knowledge for free was causing the self to become what she calls leaky, joining each of us into a vast ocean or web of relationships with other leaky selves. These two women and others who studied it observed, in other words, at the time, that big changes were taking place in the social psychology of those who did heavy internet use. But of course, what they were documenting, and they documented all the associated weird stuff, multiple personalities, the obsession with swarming against enemies, stalking people, community formation, the formation of intense personal relationships with people you don't know, seeing the online world as real, or even hyper-real, and constant attempts to create utopian communities. These were all true of people playing computer games on text platforms. But this was prehistory, because of course what we know now is that all these forms of behavior have been brought out of the world of gaming and furtive parallel universes and into the coffee bar, and into the living room, and into the lecture theatre here, the barricade, and the tent camp. Because all these forms of behavior are the way that young people, and not even young people, anybody who lives an internet lifestyle, assumes to be now quite natural. Our behaviors have begun to change. Now, of course, there is a downside to this. If you buy this, there is also a downside, or a claimed downside, to all the multitasking and hyper-social behavior that the constant use of these technologies involves. And it's this. There is a growing body of cognitive experiments that show that people who are fully immersed in the new technology perform worse on a lot of tests. Abstract thinking, retaining facts, inductive logic, mindfulness. There's a whole... Nicholas Carr, Does the Internet Make You Dumber? Wall Street Journal, 5th of June 2010, is the jump-off point to a lot of those studies. And I accept them. But here's one possible response. It sounds to me quite similar to what happened if you'd observe what happened to skilled workers when factories were introduced. That a person who was able to make a Chippendale table, now, you know, his sons can't even turn the leg of an ordinary oak kind of dinner table because they've lost the skill to make the whole thing. But if you then measure the collective effort of the factory and the collective intelligence of the factory workforce, it's more efficient. Now, it's, in other words, no surprise to me to find that the fragmented, decentered, hyper-social selves that are being created by the confluence of technology and behavior are performing badly on tests designed in the era of Doris Day. If we are right, a big change is taking place in human behavior and thinking and action. And what, above all, this combination of economics and technology and this rather intangible, but I think observable behavioral change has done is to create a zeitgeist. I think zeitgeist, it's an overused word, are terribly important. Zweig, in the book I quoted from, says, look, you know, a time does have in its ether something that is important to understand where you are. And whether it's the V for Vendetta mask, or everybody holding up a verbose sign handwritten on a piece of cardboard, as opposed to a non-verbose, slogan-driven placard printed by a union or a left-wing group, whether it's that, or whether it's the chant, I shall